The wind in the town of Redemption had teeth. It bit at Elara Vance's cheeks, a dry, scouring force that carried the grit of the plains and the scent of dust and disillusionment. It tore at the hem of her best wool dress, the one she had saved for this very day, and whipped loose strands of her tightly coiled brown hair across her face. She pushed them away with a gloved hand, her knuckles white as she clutched the worn leather handle of her small trunk. The stagecoach that had deposited her here, a solitary figure against the vast, bleached-out landscape, was already a dwindling cloud of dust on the horizon, severing her last tie to the world she had known. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was it. The start of everything new, or the end of everything she had hoped for. Before her stood the men from the letters. Mr. Alastair Finch. In his correspondence, his words had been carefully chosen, speaking of propriety, of building a respectable home, of a shared future based on mutual duty. He had painted a picture of a modest but prosperous mercantile business and a life of quiet dignity. Elara, an orphan with no prospects and a past shadowed by loss, had clung to those words like a prayer. But the man himself was a harsh revision of the author. He was shorter than she'd imagined, with a paunch that strained the buttons of his waistcoat and small, shrewd eyes that inventoried her as if she were a bolt of cloth. They swept over her, from the scuffed toes of her boots to the weary lines around her eyes, and she saw no welcome in them. Only calculation. A flicker of disappointment, then disdain. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice as thin and dry as the blowing dust. He did not offer a hand, nor did he smile. A few townspeople, loitering on the boardwalk of the general store, had stopped their whittling and gossiping to watch the transaction. Their gazes were a palpable weight on her shoulders. "Mr. Finch," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. She tried to inject a note of warmth, of eagerness, but it caught in her throat. He circled her slowly, a merchant inspecting livestock. He noted the fraying cuff of her sleeve, the paleness of her skin where the sun had not yet touched it. "You are slighter than your photograph suggested." Elara's cheeks burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. "The journey was long, sir. I have not had a proper meal in days." He grunted, a sound of profound dissatisfaction. He gestured towards her hands, still clutching the handle of her trunk. "Let me see them," it was not a request. Hesitantly, she stripped off her glove and held out her hand. He did not take it, merely stared at the palm. He saw the calluses from years of mending, scrubbing, and gardening, the quiet testaments to a life of labor she had not mentioned in her carefully penned letters. She had tried to present herself as a woman of some refinement, capable of managing a household, not a common drudge. "These are not the hands of a gentlewoman," he declared, his voice rising just enough for the onlookers to hear clearly. The judgment was swift and absolute. "My advertisement specified a woman of good breeding, fit to be a merchant's wife. Someone to host the church socials, to pour tea. These are the hands of a field worker." Humiliation, sharp and breathtaking, pierced through her. It was a public undoing. Every hope she had nurtured during the 1,000-mile journey withered under the glare of his contempt and the silent, hungry curiosity of the town. She was a spectacle. A failed mail-order bride. A piece of damaged goods returned to sender, only there was nowhere for her to be sent. "I can assure you, Mr. Finch," she began, her voice trembling, "my character is—" "Your character is not the issue," he cut in sharply. "The presentation is. I require a wife who reflects my station." "You do not," he turned his back on her then, a gesture of final, brutal dismissal. "The arrangement is void. I will not be responsible for your return passage." He walked away without a backward glance, disappearing into the dark maw of his mercantile, the bell above the door tinkling a merry, mocking little tune. The sound echoed in the sudden, vast silence. Elara stood alone in the street, her trunk a leaden anchor at her feet, the wind howling its mournful song around her. The faces of the townspeople were a blur of pity and cruel satisfaction. She had nothing. She was nothing. Less than nothing, a public fool in a town with no mercy. The hope that had sustained her for months collapsed into a cold, hard knot of despair in the pit of her stomach. The next stage would not pass through for 3 days. 3 days in a town where she had been branded, from her very first breath of its dusty air, as unwanted. The sun began its slow descent, painting the bruised sky in shades of orange and violet, colors too beautiful for the ugliness of her situation. The onlookers, their curiosity sated, began to drift away, leaving her in a widening circle of isolation. Her small savings, carefully hoarded, would barely cover a room for one night, let alone 3, and food besides. Panic, cold and sharp, began to creep up her spine. She had gambled everything on Mr. Finch's letters, on the promise of a new life, and had lost in the most public way imaginable. Her future was a terrifying blank, a sheer cliff edge at her feet. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against the chill that was settling deep into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She was adrift, a ship without a rudder or a port, and the tide was going out. From the deep shadows of the livery stable, a man detached himself from the wall he'd been leaning against. She had been vaguely aware of him throughout the entire mortifying ordeal, a tall, still figure on the periphery. He hadn't stared with the avid hunger of the others, but had watched with an unnerving, quiet intensity. Now, he moved towards her, his steps measured and unhurried on the dusty street. He was dressed in worn denim and leather, his face weathered by sun and wind to the color of old cedar. A wide-brimmed hat cast his eyes in shadow, but she could feel their weight on her. He stopped a few feet away, not crowding her, but commanding the space between them. He was not a man of the town, he was a man of the plains, of the vast, lonely distances that stretched beyond the last building. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep in the earth. It was a sound that seemed to absorb the wind rather than compete with it. That man's a fool. It wasn't offered as comfort. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered without inflection. Ilara didn't know how to respond. She could only stare at him, her throat tight with unshed tears. He gestured with his chin towards her trunk. "You have a place to stay." She shook her head, the movement small and jerky. To admit her complete destitution aloud felt like a final surrender. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over her, but his assessment felt different from Finch's. He wasn't calculating her value. He was weighing something else, something she couldn't name. He looked at her hands, still bare, and his expression didn't change. He saw the same calluses Finch had condemned, but his gaze held no judgment. If anything, it held a flicker of something that might have been recognition. "I have a homestead," he said, the words stark and unadorned. "North of here. A day's ride. It's small. But it's mine." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I need a wife. Not for pouring tea. For the work." He looked directly at her then, and for the first time she saw his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. They were a clear, startling gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, unyielding seriousness. There was no artifice in him, no pretense. "I can't offer you silks or socials. I can offer you a roof, and food in your belly, and my name. Protection. Half of whatever the land gives us." Ilara's mind reeled. It was the second proposal she had received in a single day, each one the polar opposite of the other. Finch had offered respectability and demanded delicacy. This man, this stranger, offered survival and demanded strength. He was offering her the very things Finch had rejected her for, her resilience, her capacity for hard work, embodied in the hands she now curled into fists at her sides. He saw the hesitation, the fear and confusion warring in her face. He took a half-step closer, his voice dropping even lower, meant for her ears alone against the persistent whisper of the wind. It was not a plea, not a question, but a quiet, solemn invitation that felt more like a decree. "Be mine, Miss Vance." The journey to his homestead began in the gray light of the following dawn. Ilara, having spent a fitful night in a cold boarding house room paid for with the last of her coins, met him as arranged. His name, she learned, was Silas. He offered no surname, and she did not ask. He loaded her trunk onto a pack mule with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, his movements as quiet and deliberate as his speech. He helped her onto a steady-looking mare, his hand briefly warm and firm at her elbow, the touch impersonal yet grounding. Then he swung himself into his own saddle, and they rode out of Redemption without a word, leaving the sleeping town and her humiliation behind them. The landscape that unfolded before them was a terrifying, magnificent thing. It was a world of immense scale, of rolling brown hills that stretched to a horizon so distant it seemed to merge with the impossibly vast sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the plod of the horse's hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the ever-present sigh of the wind through sparse, hardy grasses. For Ilara, who had spent her life in the close-packed, green confines of the East, it was like being set adrift on a dry, endless ocean. The sheer emptiness of it could swallow a person whole. It felt like the edge of the world, a place where one's past could be erased, but one's future was a terrifyingly blank page. Silas rode slightly ahead of her, a silent, capable guide. He seemed a part of the landscape itself, his posture relaxed in the saddle, his gaze constantly sweeping the terrain, reading its secrets. He was not a man for idle chatter. Hours passed in which the only sounds were those of their passage. Yet, his silence was not unkind. It was watchful. When they stopped to water the horses at a meager, cottonwood-lined creek, he handed her a canteen before taking a drink himself. When the midday sun beat down, he pointed to a sliver of shade cast by a rock outcropping and simply said, "We'll rest here." She observed him, her fear slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity. His hands, resting on the pommel of his saddle, were large and calloused, crisscrossed with scars. They were hands that knew work, that knew how to build and mend and hold on. He moved with a quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from a deep, ingrained competence. He was a man who understood the harsh realities of this land and had learned to live within its rules. He did not fight it, he endured it, adapted to it. There was a strength in him that was as solid and unyielding as the rock formations that dotted the hills. As the afternoon wore on, he began to speak, not to make conversation, but to instruct. His words were sparse, practical. "See how the grass is greener there. Means the ground holds water." He pointed to a hawk circling high overhead. "He's watching for rabbits. Good sign. Means the land's not entirely starved." He was teaching her, she realized. Not just how to see the land, but how to read it, how to understand its language of survival. It was a language he was fluent in, a language she would have to learn if she was to have any chance at all. This was not the life she had imagined, not the ordered, civilized world Mr. Finch had promised. This was something far more raw, more elemental. It was a life stripped down to the bare necessities: water, shelter, endurance. And as she watched the steady set of Silas's shoulders, a strange and unfamiliar feeling began to take root in the barren soil of her despair. It was not hope, not yet. It was a fragile, tentative shoot of respect. She had been offered a partnership in survival, and this silent, weathered man was her tutor. They arrived as dusk was bleeding purple and gray across the sky. The homestead was not what she expected. It was nestled into the base of a high, protective bluff, a small, sturdy cabin built of hewn logs and river stones, looking as if it had grown from the earth itself. It faced a creek that gurgled over a bed of smooth rocks, its sound a welcome music after the day's silence. A small, well-mended barn stood nearby, along with a corral holding 2 other horses who nickered a greeting. The place was utterly isolated, a tiny island of human endeavor in the vast wilderness, yet it did not feel desolate. It felt anchored. There was a sense of permanence to it, of a deep and stubborn will to exist. Silas dismounted and came to help her down. Again, his touch was brief, businesslike, but she was grateful for the support. Her body ached from the long hours in the saddle. He unloaded her trunk and carried it to the cabin door as if it weighed nothing. "Home," he said. The single word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was a statement, not a question. This was her home now. He pushed the door open, and she stepped inside. The last of the daylight filtered through a single window, illuminating a space that was Spartan and yet meticulously clean. A large stone hearth dominated one wall, its surface swept clean of ash. A rough-hewn table and 2 straight-backed chairs stood in the center of the room. A shelf held a few tin plates, a handful of books, and a neatly folded stack of blankets. And against the far wall, there was a bed, a single bed, with a patchwork quilt pulled taut over what was likely a straw-filled mattress. The stark reality of their arrangement, of the word wife, settled upon her with a sudden, suffocating weight. This was not just a partnership of labor. It was a marriage, however unconventional its beginning. Her breath caught in her throat. Silas seemed to understand her unspoken fear. He didn't look at her, but moved to the hearth, laying kindling and logs with practiced ease. "The bed is yours," he said to the stones, his back to her. "I'm used to the floor." He struck a match, and the kindling caught, casting flickering, warm light into the growing shadows. The fire crackled to life, a small, cheerful sound in the immense quiet. He then retrieved a bedroll from a wooden chest in the corner and laid it out on the floor near the hearth, a clear and deliberate distance from the bed. He did it without ceremony, without any hint that it was a sacrifice. It was a simple, unspoken act of decency, a granting of space and respect she had not expected. In that small gesture, in the quiet honor it represented, the first true crack appeared in the wall of fear and mistrust she had built around her heart. He had offered her his name, and in this first test, he had shown himself to be a man who understood its weight. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, a cadence of hard, unceasing work. Silas rose before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the wooden floor her first awareness of the new day. He would be gone for hours, tending to his small herd of cattle that roamed the hills, mending the miles of fence that marked his claim, or working with a wild-eyed colt in the corral, his patience a quiet, powerful force against the animal's fear. Ilara's domain became the cabin and its immediate surroundings. She had expected to feel like a prisoner in this isolated place, but instead, she discovered a surprising sense of purpose. The work was demanding, but it was honest. It was hers. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, baked bread in the small hearth oven until the cabin filled with its warm, comforting scent, and mended Silas's worn shirts, her stitches small and even. These were the skills of her past, once a source of shame in the face of Mr. Finch's expectations, but here they were a currency. They were her contribution to their shared survival. She was earning her keep, not as a dependent, but as a partner. The silence between them continued, but it was no longer the strained, uncertain silence of the first day. It became a comfortable quiet, filled with the sounds of their respective labors. Communication happened through actions. A bucket of fresh, cold water from the creek would appear on the porch step when she was in the middle of laundry. A hot meal would be waiting on the table when he returned at dusk, his face etched with exhaustion. He would eat without much comment, a simple good or thank you, but she saw the appreciation in the way he cleaned his plate. One afternoon, while exploring behind the cabin, she found it, a small, rectangular plot of land, choked with weeds and littered with stones, but unmistakably a garden once. A few tenacious herbs still struggled for life at its edges. It had been neglected, abandoned. She felt an immediate kinship with the patch of earth. The next morning, she began her work. She pulled the weeds, her hands bare, feeling the satisfaction of clearing the ground. She dug out the stones, piling them to one side to make a low wall. Silas watched her from the barn for a time, his expression unreadable, but he said nothing. The following evening, she found a spade and a hoe, their blades cleaned of rust and sharpened, leaning against the cabin wall where she would find them. It was his silent approval, his contribution to her project. She worked in the garden every day, turning the soil, coaxing it back to life. She found a small packet of bean seeds in a tin in the pantry and planted them in careful rows. Tending the small plot became her solace. It was a piece of this vast, overwhelming land that she could control, that she could nurture. As she pressed the seeds into the dark, rich earth, she felt as if she were planting a piece of herself, a fragile hope for a future. The garden was a testament to her refusal to be broken. Like the struggling herbs she had found, she had survived, and now, she was determined to grow. She was no longer just the woman who had been turned down, the woman who had accepted a stranger's desperate offer. She was Ilara Vance, a woman with dirt beneath her fingernails and a small, stubborn garden that was a promise of life. The storm arrived without warning one late afternoon, a sudden and violent onslaught that turned the sky a bruised, greenish-black. The wind, once a constant whisper, rose to a ferocious howl, shrieking around the corners of the cabin and threatening to tear the very shingles from the roof. Silas had been out checking on the cattle, and Ilara watched the horizon with a growing knot of anxiety. Just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, she saw him, a lone figure on horseback, riding hard against the wind, driving the small herd towards the shelter of the bluff. He moved with a calm urgency, a man who knew the fury of these plains storms and respected their power. He had the last of the cattle secured in the barn just as the heavens opened, unleashing a deluge of rain and hail that hammered against the world with a deafening roar. He burst into the cabin, soaked to the skin, bringing the scent of rain and wet earth with him. He shut the heavy door against the tempest, the sound of the storm instantly muffled to a dull, angry roar. The cabin, which had sometimes felt like a cage, now felt like a sanctuary, a tiny, defiant fortress against the chaos outside. The dim light from the single window faded as the storm clouds consumed the last of the day, plunging them into a premature twilight. Silas lit the lantern on the table, its golden glow pushing back the shadows and casting their magnified silhouettes against the log walls. They were trapped, forced into a proximity that their daily routines usually allowed them to avoid. For a long while, they simply existed in the space, listening to the symphony of the storm. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rain beat a frantic rhythm on the roof. The fire in the hearth crackled and spat, a warm, living heart in the center of their small world. The usual silence felt different tonight, charged, expectant. It was Silas who broke it. "My father used to say you could read a storm's mind by the color of the sky," he said, his voice quiet, thoughtful. He was staring into the flames, his profile etched by the firelight. Said green meant hail, and that a sky the color of a bad bruise meant it would be long and mean. Elara, surprised by the personal nature of the comment, found her own voice. He was right, it seems. A faint, fleeting smile touched his lips. He was right about most things to do with the land. He fell silent again, but the door to conversation had been opened a crack. "My mother loved a good thunderstorm," Elara found herself saying, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. She would stand on the porch and say it was the earth getting a good, clean wash. She had a garden, not like my little patch out back. It was full of roses and lavender. The whole yard would smell of them after a rain. It was the first time she had spoken of her family, of the life she had left behind. The admission felt both risky and relieving. Silas turned his head to look at her, his gray eyes catching the lantern light. He didn't offer empty platitudes or pry for more details. He simply listened, giving her memory the respect of his full attention. "Lavender," he said, as if tasting the word. "That's a good smell." In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the untamed violence of nature, they shared these small, simple pieces of themselves. It was not a grand confession or a baring of souls. It was something quieter, more fragile. It was the discovery that beneath the calloused hands and weathered exteriors, they both carried memories of people they had loved, of a world that existed beyond the harsh reality of their daily lives. A bridge, delicate as a spider's thread, was being spun between them in the flickering light of the cabin, a connection forged not in the calm, but in the shared shelter of the storm. The wind could rage and the rain could fall, but inside their small haven, something new and quiet was beginning to take root. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright and clean, the air washed of dust, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The world seemed scrubbed new. The creek ran high and muddy, and the ground was soft underfoot. "We'll ride the fence line," Silas announced after their silent breakfast. "A storm like that can bring down trees, spook the cattle." He saddled the two horses, and for the first time, Elara felt a sense of anticipation rather than apprehension at the prospect of riding out with him. The land no longer seemed as alien or menacing. She was beginning to learn its contours, its moods. She was beginning to see it not as a wilderness, but as their territory, their home. She had become more confident on horseback, her posture straight, her hands steady on the reins. She rode beside him now, not behind, and they moved across the damp prairie in a comfortable rhythm. The storm had indeed done some damage. A large cottonwood had fallen across a section of fence, its wires snapped and tangled. They worked together to clear it, Silas with his axe, Elara pulling the smaller branches away. The physical labor was satisfying, a tangible act of restoration. She felt a sense of ownership, of pride in the land they were tending. It was in the northern pasture, miles from the cabin, that they found it. The fence hadn't been broken by a falling tree or a panicked animal. The wire had been cut cleanly, deliberately, with a pair of snips. 3 sections were laid down, an open invitation for their cattle to wander off, or for others to wander in. Silas dismounted and knelt, examining the cut, his face hardening into a mask of grim resolve. He ran his fingers over the sharp edge of the wire, then scanned the muddy ground. "Shod horses," he said, his voice low and tight. 2 riders. Came from the east. He stood up and stared across the valley, his eyes narrowed. Sterling. Elara had heard the name whispered in town, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and resentment. Jedediah Sterling was a cattle baron who had come to the territory years ago and laid claim to the best land and the biggest water sources. He ran a massive operation and believed, by right of might, that the entire valley was his domain. He was known for squeezing out smaller homesteaders, for using intimidation and dirty tricks to drive them off their claims so he could absorb their land into his own ever-expanding empire. "He thinks all the water in this valley belongs to him," Silas explained, his gaze still fixed on the horizon as if he could see his enemy there. "That creek on our land, it's one of the few that runs year-round. He wants it. He's been trying to buy me out since I filed the claim. A cold anger, unfamiliar and fierce, rose in Alara's chest. This was not an act of nature, this was an act of human greed. This was a violation. They had worked so hard, had poured their sweat and strength into this small piece of earth, and this man Sterling sought to steal it with a simple snip of wire. She looked at Silas, at the tense line of his jaw, the quiet, unbending determination in his stance. He would not be broken. He would not be driven off. And in that moment, she realized with a startling clarity that she felt the same. This was no longer just his homestead. It was hers, too. The cabin she kept clean, the garden she nurtured, the fences she now helped to mend, it was all part of a life she was building, a life she had fought for in her own quiet way. "What will we do?" she asked, her voice steady. Silas finally turned to look at her, and his expression softened slightly as he met her gaze. He saw not fear in her eyes, but a reflection of his own resolve. He had taken her in as a matter of necessity, a partner in labor. He was beginning to see her as an ally. "We'll fix the fence," he said simply. "And we'll be ready for them when they come back." They came 2 weeks later. The sun was high and hot in the sky, beating down on the dry earth. Alara was weeding her garden, which was now showing rows of vibrant green shoots, a testament to her care. She saw the dust cloud first, a rising plume on the eastern horizon. It was too large for a single rider. Her heart began to pound a heavy, rhythmic beat against her ribs. Silas was in the corral, working with the colt, and he saw it too. He straightened up slowly, his movements calm and deliberate, and walked to the cabin, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. He met her on the porch. "Go inside," he said, his voice even. "No," she replied, the word coming out with a firmness that surprised them both. She would not hide. She would not cower. This was her home, and she would stand for it. He looked at her for a long moment, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, in his gray eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod, then stepped into the cabin. He emerged a moment later with his rifle, which he held loosely in the crook of his arm. He didn't look menacing, merely prepared. Alara went inside as well, her mind racing. Her gaze fell upon the old shotgun mounted above the hearth. It had belonged to Silas's father, he had told her once. She had no idea if it was even loaded. With trembling hands, she took it down. It was heavy, smelling of oil and old wood. It felt foreign and dangerous in her arms. But holding it, she felt a surge of defiant strength. She walked back out onto the porch and stood beside Silas, the shotgun held across her body. 4 riders reined in their horses a dozen yards from the cabin. One was a large, florid man with a silver star concho on his hatband and an air of smug authority. This had to be Sterling. His men were rough-looking, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. Sterling's eyes swept over the homestead with a proprietary air, lingering on the green of Alara's garden with a sneer. He looked at Silas, dismissing him as a minor obstacle. Then his gaze fell on Alara, and his eyes widened in surprise. He had not expected a woman, especially not one holding a shotgun. "Well now, Silas," Sterling began, his voice a condescending drawl. "Didn't realize you'd taken on a housekeeper. Didn't think you could afford 1 inch," his men chuckled. "She's my wife," Silas stated, his voice flat and cold, leaving no room for argument. The words, spoken in defense of her, of them, wrapped around Alara's heart. Sterling's smirk faltered for a second. "A wife, is it? Doesn't matter. I'm here to make you a final offer for this pathetic piece of dirt. Take it and ride out, or I'll have my boys tear down your fences and run your scrawny cattle clear to the next territory." Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. His quiet stillness was more intimidating than any blustering threat. "This is my claim, Sterling. Filed legal and proper. You know the law." "I am the law in this valley," Sterling spat, his friendly facade dissolving into raw aggression. "Then you'll know the law says you're trespassing," Silas countered. "And the law says I have the right to defend my property." It was then that Alara shifted her weight, the movement small but deliberate, the barrels of the old shotgun glinting in the harsh sunlight. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence was her statement. She was not some frightened woman hiding behind the door. She stood shoulder to shoulder with her husband, a united front. They were 2 against 4, a small cabin against a cattle empire, but their resolve was a palpable force. Sterling looked from Silas's unyielding face to Alara's determined one, and saw not 2 desperate squatters, but a fortress. His men shifted uneasily in their saddles, their bravado wavering. This was not the easy intimidation they had expected. With a curse, Sterling yanked on his reins. "This ain't over," he snarled, his eyes promising retribution. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. Alara and Silas stood together on the porch, watching them go, the dust settling around them in the sudden, ringing silence. The immediate threat had passed. But they both knew it was only the beginning. The retribution came not with riders and threats, but with the stealth of a thief in the night. A week passed in tense, watchful quiet. Silas patrolled the property line each evening, Alara kept the lantern burning low through the night. The peace was a thin, fragile veneer over a bedrock of anxiety. Then, on a night when the wind blew hot and dry from the east, carrying the scent of parched earth, Alara woke to a strange, flickering orange light against the cabin window. A smell, acrid and sharp, stung her nostrils. Smoke. "Silas," she cried, scrambling from the bed. He was already on his feet, pulling on his boots, his face a grim silhouette against the unnatural glow. He threw open the door, and the heat hit them like a physical blow. The dry grass at the eastern edge of their property was ablaze, a hungry, crackling wall of fire eating its way towards the barn, towards the cabin, towards everything they had built. The wind fanned the flames, pushing them forward with terrifying speed. Sterling hadn't come to chase them off. He had come to burn them out. There was no time for fear, no time for anything but action. Their movements became a frantic, desperate dance, a synchronized effort born of pure instinct. "The well!" Silas yelled over the roar of the fire. "Soak every blanket we have." While Alara ran to the well, her heart hammering, Silas raced to the barn, releasing the terrified horses and driving them towards the relative safety of the creek bed. She worked the pump handle until her arms screamed, hauling up bucket after bucket of precious water, dousing the heavy wool blankets until they were sodden and almost too heavy to lift. He returned, grabbing 2, and they ran towards the fire line. The heat was immense, a living, breathing monster that seared their lungs and scorched their skin. They beat at the edges of the flame with the wet blankets, the hiss of steam and the choking smoke enveloping them. It was a brutal, exhausting, primal struggle. They were 2 small figures battling an elemental force of destruction. For hours they fought, their world reduced to the fire, the smoke, and each other. They moved as one, a seamless unit forged in the crucible of crisis. When a burning ember landed on the barn roof, Silas was up the ladder in an instant, beating it out with his bare hands. When Alara's strength began to fail, his hand was on her back, steadying her, his voice in her ear, "Just a little more. We can hold it." They dug a desperate firebreak with the spade and the hoe from her garden, clawing at the earth to create a barrier of bare dirt. They fought until their muscles burned with acid, until their faces were black with soot and their eyes streamed from the smoke. Slowly, agonizingly, their efforts began to tell. The fire, denied fuel by their firebreak and beaten back by their relentless assault, began to recede. Its roar diminished to a sullen crackle. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the blackened hills, the last of the flames died out, leaving behind a smoldering, scarred landscape. They had won. They had survived. Exhausted, smoke-stained, and trembling with adrenaline, they collapsed to their knees in the ash, the rising sun illuminating the devastation. In the shared fight for their home, for their very lives, every unspoken word, every tentative gesture, every wall of reserve had been burned away, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their bond. In the quiet of the new day, they stood together and surveyed the damage. A wide, black scar ran across their land, a testament to the night's battle. The air was thick with the smell of char and damp ash. The barn was singed but standing, the cabin untouched. Her garden, protected by the cabin and the well-watered ground around it, had survived. The green shoot stood as a small, defiant patch of life against the blackened earth. They had lost pasture, but they had not lost their home. They had faced the worst Sterling could throw at them, and they were still standing. Silas turned to look at her, his face streaked with soot, his gray eyes weary but clear. He truly saw her then, not just as his wife or his partner in labor, but as the woman who had stood beside him, who had fought with a ferocity that matched his own. He saw the strength she now wore, not as a shield, but as an integral part of her, as natural as the color of her eyes. He reached out, his calloused hand surprisingly gentle, and his thumb brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. The simple touch was more intimate, more profound than any kiss. "Elara," he said. Just her name, but the way he spoke it was a revelation. It held respect, admiration, and a depth of feeling he had never before allowed himself to show. It held everything that had grown between them in the silences, in the shared labor, in the heart of the storm and the trial by fire. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She was no longer the frightened, humiliated woman who had been publicly cast aside in the dusty streets of redemption. The shame of that day felt like a lifetime ago, a memory belonging to someone else. The calluses on her hands, once a mark of her unsuitability, were now a badge of her resilience, of her ability to hold on, to build, to fight. She had found her worth not in a man's approval, but in her own strength, a strength Silas had never asked her to hide. He had seen it from the very beginning. "You were brave," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "So were you," she whispered back. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Their hands, both calloused and strong, fit together perfectly. They looked out at the scarred land, not with despair, but with a shared, unspoken resolve. The threat from Sterling was not gone, but it no longer seemed insurmountable. They would rebuild the fences. The grass would grow back. They would face whatever came next, together. The arrangement born of desperation and necessity had been forged in the fire into something true and unbreakable. The quiet command he had given her on that first day, "Be mine," had transformed. It was no longer a practical offer. It was a promise, a truth that had taken root in the ashes and would, like her garden, flourish into a life of shared strength, quiet dignity, and a love as resilient and enduring as the land itself.